We'll go to Monica Marks.
Hi, my name is Monica. I'm an academic and an analyst. And for the past 5 years after the revolution, I was based in Tunis. And last year I moved back to Istanbul, which has been a kind of academic and intellectual home for me for a long time. So my research focuses mainly on AKP in Turkey and Ennahda in Tunisia and their internal politics, and also on jihadist recruitment in both countries and party politics in both countries. So just so you know what I do if any of you guys have questions. I'm a great proponent of looking at Tunisia, and I often find myself in fights with editors who think that most people just aren't very interested. And then a lot of policymakers in London and Washington, DC, and in Brussels who tend to figure that, well, Tunisia is doing pretty well compared to its neighbors. So, let's focus on actors that need more help. Let's focus on places where things are in a much more dire situation, like Libya or Syria or Iraq or Yemen. And I think the kind of effect it produces, it's almost like Tunisia is a gifted student in a special needs class. And it's allowed to fall into mediocrity, and it's not held to its full potential, and it's not given the help that it needs, financially and otherwise, because of this effect. And I think Tunisians were great critics of this after the revolution, when technical experts would come in and they'd roll out the same PowerPoint that they used in Egypt. Tunisians would say, why are you comparing us to them? Half of Egyptians can't read and write. Compare us vertically, compare us to Portugal, elsewhere. So I think the situation in Tunisia is extremely fragile. As we've seen recently in Venezuela and Turkey, in our own country, in the United States, democracy is never fixed. It's infinitely reversible, and it's contingent. And that's all the more true in a revolutionary context, when you're in the middle of a transition and the old powers that controlled the show, and the corruption and the graft and the lack of transparency, etc., all of those forces are still very much present, even though Ben Ali is in Saudi Arabia. So that's what I'd like to say first. And secondly, I think the study of a country like Tunisia is very useful because it challenges a lot of our assumptions in the West about Islam and democracy. And it forces us to start seeing gray when we only saw black and white. And I realized that at this particular moment in US political history, having a conversation about the gray can be difficult. Trying to go granular can be difficult because so much of what propelled Trump to the presidency was reductionism, reducing complex and very distinct trends, lumping them together, and labeling them as an enemy. So I just wanted to give you 4 quick examples of how Tunisia disrupts our assumptions. I could sit for hours giving so many more examples, but here are just 4 ones that I think are especially fun. In Tunisia, after the revolution, you had a party, Ennahda, which was a center-right Islamist party, that had been terribly oppressed for decades. Tens of thousands of its supporters had been put in jail and tortured. And this was mainly because Tunisia's 2 post-independence presidents both feared Ennahda as a political threat. So they tried to label it as a terrorist actor, and they tried to say that it wanted nothing more than a kind of retrograde 7th century caliphate, and that it wanted to make Tunisia just like Iran after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And after the Tunisian revolution in 2011, a lot of Western observers had the same fear, because the only model of Islam and revolution that they could invoke was 1979 Iran. So the whole conversation was, is this going to be an Islamist winter? And I just want to give you 4 quick examples that kind of complicate this. In 2012, there was a march of prostitutes in downtown Tunis. In Tunis, prostitutes are officially employees of the Ministry of the Interior. They do a state service. And after the revolution, a lot of people, lots of disparate groups, were campaigning for their rights because they were inspired by the revolution. And the prostitutes also were inspired, and they said, we wanted better working conditions, we want better pay. So they protested in front of the Ministry of Interior, in summer 2012. And there was only one politician who met with those prostitutes. I wonder if anybody knows who it is. It was Mahrazi al-Abidi. Mabruk, who said that? Somebody over there. A Tunisian, of course. It was the most powerful woman in the center-right Islamist party, Ennahda, Mahrazi al-Abidi. And in 2012 and 2013, she was the most powerful woman anywhere in the Arab world in politics. She was the vice president of the National Constituent Assembly that was writing the new constitution. And Mahrazi al-Abidi went and she met with those women. Interesting. Here's a second example. Lately, in the past few years, homosexuality has been more of a public debate in Tunisia. It wasn't really a public debate before. And the two main leaders of the two most powerful parties in the country are President Beji Qaid Essebsi, who leads the self-proclaimed modernist, so-called secular anti-Islamist party, Nidaa Tounes, and Rashid Ghannouchi, who is the president of Ennahda, the Islamist party. So what were their statements? Well, the supposed secularist, Essebsi, came out and said that it would never be decriminalized. Homosexuality will always be criminalized, basically not over my dead body. Rashid Ghannouchi, interestingly, came out with a more malleable position. His position was basically don't ask, don't tell. He said there's a difference between the private sphere and the public sphere, and we don't have the right to go nosing around in the private sphere, but it's still wrong. But you understand that, interestingly, the Islamists' position was softer. It was more relaxed. I mean, neither position feels good to a Western liberal. They're both problematic from that perspective, but interesting. Okay, here's a third example. Inside the Islamist party, Ennahda, what issues since the revolution have caused the most debate between leaders and members of the party's base? As an academic, my PhD is about this very issue, debates inside Ennahda. So I go all around speaking about this, and I got a lot of questions from people. And the assumption that most people have is that because Ennahda is a so-called Islamist party, all of the base is kind of like this kind of frothing, almost Islamo-fascist rabble. And they want Sharia, and they want it bad. And they're very upset about women's rights and blasphemy and things of that nature. And most people think that the concessions that the leaders have made that most anger the base are concessions such as agreeing not to put the word Sharia in the post-revolutionary constitution. But that's not what my research has found. I've interviewed hundreds of people in Ennahda since 2011, at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. And what I've found is that the issues that have caused the most controversy have been over political concessions. Specifically, an electoral lustration law that Andrew mentioned, which would have made it impossible for members of the old regime, people who served under Ben Ali, including the current president, Beji Qaid Essebsi, from contesting the 2014 elections. And Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi went to the Tunisian parliament and he personally shouted at his bloc and lobbied them not to vote for this thing because he thought politically this is stupid, it's going to create a constituency for a coup, which is quite true, it probably would have. Ultimately the law failed to pass by one vote, and it was the vote of an Ennahda member who switched his vote of support to a vote of abstention. And man, did that make a lot of people in the base angry. Because that law wasn't just supported by Ennahda's base, it was supported by secular parties too. Here's one last example. A lot of people characterize any Islamist party as quite fascistic in its internal organizational structure. But it's very interesting to look at Ennahda's organizational structures and compare them with those of other parties in Tunisia. Since it began as the Islamic tendency movement in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Ennahda tried to have three branches that parallel the branches in the United States government: executive, legislative, and judicial. And the members of their legislative body, the Majlis Shura, the Shura Council, are elected and are intended to represent the base. No other party in Tunisia was like that. Tunisia was a classic one-party state. Bourguiba's party at the time, the secular president's party, more closely mirrors the way AKP looks today in Turkey, where you just have a president who basically runs the whole show and he coronates whatever leader he wants, and there's really no internal democracy whatsoever. That's very interesting. Just one example of how that's played out. There's one party in Tunisia in recent years whose members have physically prevented the executive board of the party from holding a meeting to talk about the party's future. And I think a lot of outside observers would expect that kind of behavior from Islamists. That's very anti-democratic behavior. But in fact, the party that's done that is President Essebsi's party, Nidaa, Tounes. His son Hafid had a faction within the party that were actually thugs, hired thugs, with sticks that prevented other members of the party from holding a meeting. So that's just to kind of problematize these assumptions that we make about so-called secularists and so-called Islamists. I feel that both of these terms often confuse so much more than they clarify. And just one last point before I hand it over. Living in Turkey and having also done a lot of research on Turkey, I think what's happened to AKP, the very sad story of a party with some religious roots that came into an illiberal secular state structure and in the early years looked like they might have made things more democratic, but then have reverted backwards. I think a lot of folks who are familiar with the example of AKP feel extremely critical of Ennahda and of any so-called Islamist party now, and for good reason, because they feel like AKP made them look like fools. Because a lot of the analysts who were quite positive about the AKP experience, while everybody else was telling them no, Islamists can never be Democrats, they now feel once bitten, twice shy. But the internal organizational structures of Ennahda and AKP have always been pretty different in terms of Ennahda being more democratic. And I would just like to point out, I was very surprised by Ennahda's reaction to the Turkish referendum last month. Instead of vocally praising Erdogan as a kind of cousin party, the reactions within Ennahda were quite restrained. And you can see that there's some learning going on.
Thank you. We'll go to Radwan in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So we can move to Q&A.
Thank you, Monji. Good afternoon, everybody. I wasn't supposed to be on this panel. We had invited somebody from Nidaa, Tunis, to come speak on this panel, but unfortunately, until a couple of days ago, they canceled, or he canceled on us. So I just have a few remarks I wanted to add to what has been said. As you know, CSID, most of you are familiar with CSID. We've been established in 1999. So for the first 12 years, we focused right here in Washington on the policy of the United States toward the Muslim world, towards supporting and promoting democracy in the Muslim world, because we feel very strongly that democracy is the only way or the only path forward for the Arab world and the Muslim world. So we've been advocating for that. We've been organizing many conferences on that topic. But since 2011, we focused most of our effort on Tunisia. I spent at least 50%, maybe more of my time in the last 6 years in Tunisia, because we thought that we really needed a success story out of the Arab Spring. We knew that it was going to be difficult, it was going to be challenging, but instead of spending our energy or limited resources on different countries, we said, let's focus on one country and let's hope to make a difference and build a good success story. So I'm happy to tell you that we have made a difference. CSID in Tunisia is very active. There is an annual report that you can pick up on the table out there to give you an idea of the type of activities and dialogues that we have been organizing on a weekly basis in Tunisia to facilitate the success of the democratic transition. So I just have a few points that I wanted to tell you about our experience there. First of all, democratic transitions are inherently difficult, and inherently long. They take at least 15 years. In most cases, they take 20 years. So unless you have that knowledge, unless you know, and believe me, in Tunisia, we looked very, very closely at the experience of other countries all over the world to learn from their experience. Unless you understand that democratic transitions are going to take 15 to 20 years, and you have that long-term vision, you're going to fail because you don't understand the dynamics of change. It's not easy to change from dictatorship to democracy. So we are still in 6 years out of 15 or 20 years. So we are still at the beginning in Tunisia in this democratic transition. We are very happy that we are still on the path of democracy. We are still moving forward. We are still implementing reforms. And we have the MP here, Mr. Naufal Al-Jamali, who has given us some of the reforms that they are working on a daily and weekly basis to reform the system, to reform the laws, to reform the institutions, and ultimately to reform the culture, because it's all about culture of tolerance and culture of diversity and culture of accepting different opinions. After you live for 60 years in one party rule, one man rule, one ideology, one thinking, and if you deviate from that, you are a traitor basically to the country. It takes time to change that mentality. So we are still on the path to democracy in Tunisia, but we understand it's very difficult, it's very challenging. The main challenge right now in Tunisia is the economic challenge. I just came back from Tunisia 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, and believe me, the situation is very, very, in my mind, alarming. The economy is really in trouble, and the Tunisian model or the Tunisian experience could fail. And I'm not talking about 10, 15 years, could fail in 6 months or in a year because of the failing economy. So I am worried, even though we have made a lot of progress in 6 years, I'm very worried that the situation is, as Monica said, still fragile, very fragile. I think the Tunisians have done their part. Believe me, the Tunisians understand very well that they have a unique chance or time or unique experience, and that the whole Arab world at least is watching them and watching to see if they can succeed in this democratic transition in the Arab world. So they have done their part. Secularists and Islamists are working together, have been working together since 2011, but even today, in the government, in the parliament, in many institutions, they have overcome their differences. I mean, their differences still exist, but they have been able to work together. And they, of course, they won the last year, a year and a half ago, won the Nobel Peace Prize for the national dialogue, for their ability to build consensus on many issues, on the constitution, of course, which was the hardest one. It was not easy to build, a constitution that, 90% or 93% of Tunisians agree on. But on many, many other laws and many other things, they have done their homework and they have done their work to build that dialogue and to work together. However, I feel that the international community has really not supported Tunisia. The title of my paper that is about to appear in a book is The Failure of the International Community to Support Tunisia. And it's coming out soon in a book that I will announce. It's not published yet. Yes, the United States has supported Tunisia. The European Union has supported Tunisia. So it's not lack of support, but it is insufficient support. It is very insufficient compared to the needs and the historic moment and opportunity that we have in Tunisia. Yes, the United States, for example, increased support from about 30 million a year to about 140 million a year. So it's 3 or 4 times, 5 times more than what it was before the revolution. But that's not enough. That's nothing. And it really is not helping. As I said, the economy is in trouble. The economy could fail and could derail the whole process. So at the end of the day, we have a very tough time to make democracy succeed unless there is an economic success, unless people, especially young people, think that their life is better after the revolution, that there are more opportunities, more economic growth, more jobs. Right now they don't. Right now they feel that either they stagnated. Last year the economic growth was less than 1%. And Tunisia has never had less than 1% economic growth. We've always had 5% on average or more. So the young people are very upset, are very concerned, are very unhappy. And so I am really worried. And yes, Tunisia long-term wants to bring investment to Tunisia, because ultimately that's how you succeed in the economy. But investors also want to see more stability. They want to see more reforms. They're not coming. For the last 5 years, last year we had no investment whatsoever. So they are not coming. There is no investment. The economy is really struggling. And young people are not, my worry is young people are not going to wait. And they're not waiting right now. In many cities, there are daily demonstrations. And what's the word for it? Sittings and things like that.
1 minute.
So despite the fact that Tunisia, I think, is a success story, I remain very worried and very concerned that we might lose this success story. And the implications for the Arab world, if we lose this only success story, are going to be very dire for the next 50 years, maybe 100 years. So that's my concern, that's my worry. That's why I'm going back to Tunisia next week to try to see what we can do to help. But I hope that the United States will do more to help Tunisia, because we need a success story in Tunisia. We cannot afford failure in Tunisia. The whole region, and I think the whole world, cannot afford failure in Tunisia.
Thank you.
I hope the United States will do more to help Tunisia, to make sure it doesn't fail. But I am concerned and I am worried, despite my usual optimism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have members from the State Department here, so I hope they'll take the message back to and it's very hard to be. It's very hard to be a moderator when your boss is sitting there. You try to tell him it's only 1 minute left, but I'm trying to give as much time as for you guys to ask some questions. So there's 2 microphones. If you have a question, please step up to the mic. While we're waiting for the first question, I have a question of my own, and hopefully we can get quick answers. To Dr. Jamal, you spoke about the challenges, and you spoke about the lack. You even mentioned the word corruption, and you said there is a lack of resources to fighting this. Do you think there is a political will to fight the corruption? And I'm looking even at the people who are present here, and I can see some people who they actually have tried to do projects in Tunisia for years, and they faced some real challenges. And their main complaint always, even throughout these administrations that we had, about 6 or 7, that corruption. Do you think that we have the political will to fight it?
I think for sure there is a political will, but we have a problem in Tunisia, a general problem when we speak about administration. We have this very mysterious incapacity to build the vision, to identify our needs. Even when we speak with our international partner, we have all the difficulties of the world to identify our needs. And we are not asking the right question to our friends all over the world in order they help us to fight corruption with the best way. There's a will, a political will, but we suffer from a lack of know-how. We have no clear vision about how to fight this scourge in Tunisia.
Thank you.